Hi guys, welcome to the Classicist Corner. I'm Kat, and this week I'm going to be talking about ghosts because Halloween is right around the corner and I feel like talking about something spooky. So, ghosts. Well, ghosts were a part of Greek and Roman attitudes towards death and were a feature of quite a lot of ancient texts. One of the earliest of which is the Iliad, where the ghost or spirit of Patroclus returns to Achilles in a dream. Yes, in the Iliad, ghosts do not exist in their own physical form. They can only talk to humans through dreams, as Patroclus does. Now, his ghost has a very specific focus in the ancient Greek context towards death. Patroclus returns to Achilles because Achilles has not buried him, and Patroclus returns because he asks Achilles to bury him properly so he can pass on into the underworld. In the context of the Iliad, if a Greek hero dies, they can either pass on to the underworld or stay as a shade, sort of in between the living and the dead, and it's just not a very nice experience. Then again, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, which I'll get to in a bit, the idea of death is a horrendous idea to the mortal characters. Not only because they might not be buried properly on a battlefield, which is a fear, and therefore remain, as Patroclus did, as sort of this wandering shade along the pathway between living and dead, but because death is awful. The underworld is not a good place. Now, this is very early on in attitudes towards the underworld, so there isn't really the idea of Tartarus as this torturous place or Elysium as this wonderful place. There is just this mass of death, which is Hades. Also in the Iliad you get the idea of the spirit leaving the body. Now, that's one of the first things you see in the Iliad, is mentions of Greek souls leaving their body. Now, the Greek word for soul is actually in archaic Greek is actually the same word for the Greek word for breath. So the breath physically leaves the body, and that is the sign that the spirit has left the body. So that's the ghosts in the Iliad as rendered by Patroclus. Then in the Odyssey, staying with Homer, you get a scene in book 11 of the Odyssey where Odysseus has to get counsel from the dead. He has to get counsel from the dead Tiresias, seer. So he summons ghosts from the underworld. He goes to a liminal place by a river to bring ghosts and the underworld up into the world of the living. And he does this sacrifice of this bull, and it's all very spooky. If you want a spooky bit of the Iliad, it's book 11. It's really creepy. So he brings the ghosts up, and they're these tormented figures, lots of them still freshly hurt from the wars at Troy, and they all have the injuries that they gained when they were alive and the injuries that killed them. So, and one of the ghosts is Achilles. So much like Patroclus is a ghost, Achilles himself dies and is a ghost in the underworld, and he tells Odysseus that he would rather be a beggar among the living than a king among the dead, because his existence in the underworld is just so not an existence. So there we have ghosts in early archaic texts, where the underworld is this just place where shades just exist with no real purpose. And yeah, all the glory that they gained in life means nothing to them after death, which for an ancient Greek man would be fairly terrifying, be quite scary. So book 11, nice and creepy. Then we get into later texts and later attitudes towards ghosts and the dead. In both Greek and Roman cities, even though it's slightly different, their burial grounds would always be outside the city walls. So in Rome you have these sort of walls of tombs heading to the cities, where people will be cremated, and you have these tombs. That's Rome. In Athens you have the Kerameikos, which again, these burial centres are nearly always outside the realms of the city. Now, this is for practical reasons, of course, because really, when you have these ancient cities which are prone to plagues and war anyway, you don't really want dead bodies in your city. So that's the practical reason. But the Greeks and Romans were quite superstitious about ghosts within the city walls. they felt like if a person died without a proper burial, which again, the Greeks and Romans were fairly uptight about burials, which is understandable. If they would die without a proper burial, or if they died traumatically or with anger within them, then that person could return as a vengeful spirit, so rising up out of the underworld to cause havoc. And actually ancient witchcraft, which is a thing, I will get to that in some of the video, maybe next Halloween, I don't know, would actually create little figures to be able to use the power of these ghosts. There is even a chthonic, which means god of the underworld or god of the below, chthonic goddess Melanoe, who is dedicated specifically to ghosts. There is a goddess, ancient Greek goddess of ghosts, Melanoe. She is described in the Orphic hymns as the daughter of Persephone and Hades. She is a ghost of madness and chaos. So much like ghosts themselves in ancient Greek and Roman myth, she is a terrifying figure that will rise up and cause chaos. Specifically found in places where, again, the Greeks and Romans had this idea of liminality, which I've talked about in one of my Harry Potter videos, actually, from way back when. Which is the idea of space between the proper and the not, space between civilization and barbarism, space between real society and the other. So there is this sort of space which is a liminal space, so a bit between, and graveyards, crossroads, all of these spaces were liminal spaces, and that's a place where people felt that Melanoe, the goddess of ghosts and chaos and madness, would come up. So people would be a little bit afraid of that. Yeah, people would also be afraid of going on the sea, because they felt if they didn't have a proper burial, if they died at sea, they would be a wandering spirit like Patroclus's ghost. So the ancient Greeks had an idea of a clear underworld where their spirit would go to, but there was also a fear that their spirit wouldn't physically, and again, in the Greek mythology, the underworld is a physical place that a physical spirit would go. So they were a little bit afraid that if something happened, if they weren't buried, or if they died in certain ways, or even if they became part of this pack that followed this goddess of ghosts and madness, that their spirit could end up wandering without a proper resting place, and that is quite spooky and quite terrifying to an ancient Greek person. And I'm just wondering if you'd find it quite so scary, guys. So if you find the idea of ancient Greek ghosts scary, if you're a little bit concerned of this goddess of ghosts, pop it down below in the comments. Tell me your plans for Halloween, if you're doing anything ancient and scary, and I will see you next week with something a bit different. Bye guys!